Hello and welcome to our deeper dive for the 7th week of rerouting. This week we've been continuing the bad news. Last week we began digging into the bad news by answering the question, why is everything so obviously messed up? And so we talked about the rebel, the enemy that has invaded our world, led humanity into rebellion against God. And as a result, humanity has fallen into captivity to this rebel. And this is really bad news. Jesus says that this rebel comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy. So this is very bad. This isn't inane. And yet, it gets worse. Scripture and the tradition go to great lengths to show that humanity isn't just captive. We're not just victims. Humanity is also complicit. We go along with it. There's something within us, or better, there's something lacking within us that gives us a certain inclination to go along with the plans of the rebel, to live this ego drama I was talking about on Sunday. We've all been infected with a contagion, contracted this disease, and so we're left in a state of deprivation, deprived of the fullness of our heart, the fullness of our humanity. And because of this, our heart has this inclination towards sin. So this is the bad news. Not only are we born into this world as captives to powers we literally can't compete with, captives to sin and death and Satan and his kingdom, we also have a heart that is badly wounded, lacking, inclined toward all this. This is where the bad news really hits close to home. Within my heart itself, something's missing. And my heart is then prone to go looking for that something in all the wrong places. This is why what we want to dig into today is this. Specifically, first, we want to dig into the subsequent narratives in Genesis. The first 11 chapters of Genesis, they form this sort of literary unit. It's one section. And Adam and Eve, they rebel in chapter 3. So we have 8 more chapters to go. These chapters of Genesis are trying to describe the gravity of our situation. So first we want to dig into that. But then we want to zoom in on one passage in particular, Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. We've all heard the story of Cain and Abel, but we really want to dive into this one verse in particular. This verse, it serves as kind of a key to so much more that's coming later in the story. And finally, we want to take a look at what is called the Proto-Evangelium, the first gospel. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we get the first glimpse of what God is planning to do. And so we'll look at this, which is also really preparing us for what is coming up in rerouting, especially starting next Sunday. So let's dive in. So first, the narrative of Genesis. I would really encourage you to go read those first 11 chapters of Genesis on your own, because we know all the famous stories from them. Like we've heard them as kids: Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and the ark. And maybe if you're a real Bible nerd, you've read the story of the Tower of Babel. So you know the stories, but we typically know them from a child's perspective. The Bible isn't a children's storybook, although it has stories you can tell the children. Stories are an effective way to communicate. That's why we tell them. But the deeper meaning of these stories, that often escapes us. And these stories in the early chapters of Genesis are no different. So after Adam and Eve rebel in Genesis 3, the narrative actually continues by showing that something has happened. Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, but what does that really mean? This is what Genesis goes on to show. Genesis paints the picture of what the church calls the condition of original sin. Original sin is something each and every one of us are born with. But original sin is not like this personal sin that we've committed. It's something we've inherited. It's the name for the thing we lack. We're born without something. So it's actually kind of a paradox. We're born with original sin, which actually means we've been born without something. We lack something. Our humanity is incomplete. It's in a fallen state, as the church teaches. And what does this look like in action? Well, this is what Genesis continues to tell us. In a narrative way, though. Genesis doesn't give us a systematic or scientific or theological explanation. It gives us a narrative. And that narrative starts with two brothers, Cain and Abel, and it spirals out of control. In the story of Cain and Abel, Cain kills his brother out of jealousy. And then each generation of Cain's descendants gets progressively worse. 6 generations in, so the 7th generation, Cain's line reached a kind of diabolical fullness. And a descendant named Lamech. Lamech was the first polygamist in Scripture, but he is also murderous as all get out. He boasted to his wives. He said, I have slain a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain has avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 77-fold. So on the 7th day, creation reached its fullness, but here in the 7th generation, evil has reached a kind of fullness. But Genesis doesn't stop there. Genesis also traces the line of the other child of Adam and Eve. So Abel died, but Adam and Eve then have Seth. And Seth, the line of Seth, is not evil. In fact, it's very godly. We're told that the descendants of Seth, there's this line, they began to call on the name of the Lord, which in biblical language, that's a key phrase that signifies covenantal worship. So it's a big deal, but this is what it's saying. These people are following the path given by God. So everything's great now, right? No more problems? Come on. Genesis then says this, when men began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, so that's the descendants of Seth, saw that the daughters of men, so that's the descendants of Cain, were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. So what? Big deal. Seth's great-great-great-great-grandkids are marrying Cain's great-great-great-great-grandkids. Like, who cares? They're in love. But that's not what Genesis is saying. Here are these godly people following God, and they stray from that path. Okay? They go after ungodly things. If it was just people falling in love, why would Genesis then say this? The Lord saw that the evil of the human creature was great on the earth, and that every scheme of his heart's devising was only perpetually evil. What's the deeper truth Genesis is communicating? Our heart's desires are inclined toward evil. Our hearts easily lead us astray. This is where you then get the story of Noah. The flood is not meant as God's angry solution. It's a new beginning. Not an angry God wiping everything out in anger, but one intent on renewing the good world he had created. And so we get the Noah story. But in the aftermath of the flood, the human race once again became one big unhappy family, torn apart by sin. Eventually, all this leads to the Tower of Babel, and this tower represents humanity trying to build their own kingdom, trying to usurp God's kingdom. Again, it's the story of the garden replaying itself over and over. The same deception. If only you were in the place of God, you would finally be happy. And so it goes bad. God scatters the people. So this is where the initial section of Genesis ends. This section of prehistory, we call it, ends here. Genesis 12 is going to pick up with the story of God's covenantal family, beginning with Abraham. But here in Genesis 11, we see the tragic depths to which humanity, the heart of humanity, has descended. We're in a hopeless situation. The question is, can anything restore us? But I want to back up real quick to the story of Cain and Abel. I think there's some real gold there. The story of Cain and Abel is well known, but not deeply known. Most of us just skim over it or just say, oh yeah, brother kills brother. We need to read more deeply. Like I mentioned in my homily this past Sunday, Cain and Abel aren't just two brothers, they're two parts of the human heart. Cain and Abel represent all that is good and all that is bad in humanity. All that's good and all that's bad in you. We're not either Cain or Abel, we're both. I brought up Alexander Solzhenitsyn on Sunday, the famous Russian novelist who spent close to a decade in the Russian gulags. This idea is what Solzhenitsyn was trying to communicate when he said, the line between good and evil runs not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who's willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Cain and Abel don't just represent two completely separate kinds of humans. It's not like, well, one person's Cain and another person's Abel. No, wrong. You're both. These are two different potential patterns of destiny. You don't manifest one purely and the other zero. The line between good and evil runs down the human heart. Maybe you're more like Cain, or maybe you're more like Abel, but there's still always a little Cain in you, no matter how able you think you are. And maybe more than a little, and probably more than a little. John Steinbeck, he centered his masterpiece, East of Eden, on this very story. He said that it's this story, the story of Cain and Abel. He said, this little story turns out to be one of the most profound in the world. He says, and in East of Eden, it's this very same dynamic at play. The line between good and evil abides in the human heart, and the choice is yours. The main theme for East of Eden turns on the translation of the Hebrew word timshel in Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. In this verse, God warns Cain. He warns him before he kills his brother. God tells Cain, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but timshel it. As Steinbeck narrates in East of Eden, the word timshel is actually translated different in different versions of the Bible. And that's because the word's ambiguous. It could be translated a lot of different ways, but the translation determines everything. Everything hinges on how we understand that one word there in Genesis. There's three options for how to translate it. The first that often comes up is that God promises Cain that he will conquer sin. Thou shalt rule over it. The second is that God orders Cain to conquer sin. Do thou rule over it. But in the third, God blesses Cain with free will, leaving him the choice. Thou mayest rule over it. John Steinbeck wrote that timshel might just be the most important word in the world. Why? Well, in the novel, this is what Steinbeck writes. He says, the Hebrew word timshel, thou mayest, that gives a choice. For if thou mayest, it is also true that thou mayest not. That makes a man great, and that gives him stature with the gods. For in his weakness and his filth and his murder of his brother, he has still the great choice. He can choose his course and fight it through and win. Timshel, thou mayest or thou mayest not. This is our fundamental choice, always and everywhere. John Steinbeck wrote that this word, timshel, might just be the most important word in the world. Why? Because he understood that the line between good and evil runs through the human heart, and we have to choose. But this leads to our third point. Because even though we can choose between good and evil, well, first, we're inclined towards evil, so that's the condition of our heart, and that's not great. But also, even if we were to never, ever choose evil, we still find ourselves in captivity. So how do we fix this? Well, in Genesis chapter 3, immediately after Adam and Eve rebel, we're given what's called the proto-evangelium, the first gospel. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we see God make one of his first promises in the Bible. It's a rescue plan to restore humanity back to their original place in the garden. God promises that the seed, the offspring of the woman, would one day rise up against the serpent to crush its head. But the serpent would strike the heel of this snake crusher. It's a confusing promise, left with no further explanation until later in the story. So let's get some insight first from our friends over at Bible Project.
There's this crazy story at the beginning of the Bible. We have Adam and Eve, and they're in the Garden of Eden.
And everything in this garden is great. It's exactly as it should be, except there's this one tree that they're told by God not to eat from because it's dangerous and it will kill them.
So that's it. Avoid this fruit tree and we're fine.
Right. It seems pretty simple. But in this garden, there's a snake. And it starts telling a different story. It says that if you eat of this tree, it's not going to kill you. In fact, it's going to make you become like God.
And Adam and Eve, they believe the snake and they eat the fruit.
And because of this, the goodness of the garden is tragically lost and evil and death enters into God's good world.
Now, Why is there a talking snake in the garden? I mean, this thing is a problem.
Yeah, it's very strange. And even more strange is the fact that the Bible doesn't say why or how this thing even got there. It just presents the snake as this creature who's in rebellion against God and that wants to get other people to doubt God's goodness and lead them on a path towards death. And so whatever this snake is, it's the source of evil that pervades our world and our lives, even still today.
But there is some hope because right here in the story, God makes this really interesting promise to Adam and Eve.
That someone is going to come in the future, a son of Eve. And this guy's going to come and he's going to crush the serpent's head and destroy evil at its source. However, during this battle, the serpent is going to bite this guy's heel.
So it's like a mutual destruction.
Yeah, it's this very strange but beautiful promise. And it's just left hanging there until the next key moment in the story when God singles out this guy named Abraham and says that through his family, goodness and blessing is going to be restored back to all of the nations of the world. And as we follow this family, we get to one of Abraham's great-grandsons, this guy named Judah. And he receives this promise that a king is going to come from his line and that the whole world's going to follow this king and he's going to bring peace and harmony and there'll be lots of food and wine and milk and vineyards and it's going to be awesome.
The first king that we meet from the line of Judah is a guy named King David. And he's a hero. Maybe he is the snake crusher.
But it turns out that David is infected with the same evil as the rest of humanity. He never crushes the snake, just the opposite. However, God makes a promise to David that this king is going to eventually come from his line. But as you go on in the story, one by one, each generation of his sons, they're just total chumps. They give in to the snake, they choose evil, they go after money and sex and power and following other gods.
Things get so bad that they run the nation of Israel right into the ground, and the big bad empire of Babylon just takes them out.
And so now there are no more kings to even fulfill this promise.
So it seems like the whole plan is lost.
But during these dark days, there's this crazy group of guys called prophets, and they just kept talking about this coming king and reminding us of the promise that he'll come, he'll defeat evil, he'll restore the garden. Now, one specific prophet, Isaiah, he tells us more about why this king is bitten. Isaiah says that the promised king receives this wound because of humanity's evil, and then it kills him. But then all of a sudden he comes back, and Isaiah says it's because he suffered this wound that he can now become a source of healing to other people.
But the Old Testament ends, and the snake-crushing king that everyone's been talking about never shows up.
And this is why, when the New Testament begins, it introduces us to Jesus of Nazareth, not as some random guy, but as someone who comes to fulfill these specific ancient promises.
Yeah, we learn that he's from the line of David, Judah, and Abraham.
And he goes around Israel announcing that the goodness of God's kingdom is here, now. And he begins confronting the effects of evil on people by healing them, by forgiving them of their sins and evil.
Many people are now believing that this is, in fact, the promised king.
But Jesus began telling his closest followers that he was going to become king and bring peace by taking the full effect of humanity's evil into himself.
The fatal snakebite wound.
Exactly. And so it seems like the serpent wins. And this story actually would be a tragedy except for what happens next.
What happens next? Well, I think you have already heard what happens next, but we'll save that for next week. So what's going on? Well, here God begins a story tracing the offspring of this woman. Genesis traces the line of Seth all the way to Abraham, and Abraham to Isaac, and Isaac to Jacob, who's named Israel. And Israel, he has his 12 sons. So the offspring keeps coming, but none are this serpent crusher. We get royalty like David and Solomon and Hezekiah, but still not the serpent crusher. And the prophets, the hope continues, but still no serpent crusher. The Old Testament traces the lineage very, very closely, but no one comes until we crack open the New Testament. And each of the 3 synoptic gospels makes a point to say something about it. Matthew opens up by saying, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then it traces Jesus' lineage back to Abraham. Mark begins by saying, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. So Mark's directly connecting Jesus to the royal line of David. Son of God is a title of the Davidic king. So he's tracing Jesus back to the kings. And Luke traces Jesus' lineage back not just to Abraham, but to the son of Adam, the son of God. I hope that you're starting to see, if nothing else, that Scripture isn't just a book filled with nice stories or a book like Aesop's Fables that tells story with a moral to them. No. Scripture is one intricately and beautifully woven story that tells a very specific tale. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is everything so obviously messed up? And what, if anything, has God done about it? What has God done about it? Well, since the beginning, He's been writing this story. He's been working His plan to rescue us. And next week, we'll turn to that great rescue that He has promised.